Hello everyone, Fat Dorsey from the Blue Quill Angler in Evergreen, Colorado. Welcome to this evening's Umpqua signature fly tying session. I'm really thrilled to share some of my favorite tailwater patterns that'll hopefully elevate your game to the next level. With that being said, let's don't waste any time. Let's just get right to the program here and start out with one of my favorite midge imitations, the Mercury Black Beauty. The first fly that I'm going to be tying this evening is going to be the first pattern that I got into the Umpqua catalog is going to be the Black Beauty. And I think we can all agree as we head into the winter season, it's hard to underestimate the importance of midges because midges are so critically important this time of year. And what midges lack in size, they make up in numbers. So it's very, very important for us to fish midges this time of year. And the Black Beauty is a midge pupa. So as a tailwater enthusiast, we should familiarize ourselves with the larva, the pupa, and the adult. And anytime that we see a midge hatch in progress, that's a sign to us as fly fishers that we should start to be fishing with pupa patterns and more importantly, fishing those imitations mid-column. I tie the Black Beauty on a Tiemco 101 in sizes 18 through 22, typically fish larger flies in the spring when we have the big spring midge, and during the dead of winter, typically 22s and 24s. And I found that fishing a smaller fly like a 24 can be a huge advantage to heavily pressured waters. I tend to catch more fish on a 24 than I do in a 22. So if you're going to err on one side or the other, go small. We'll begin with a jam knot behind the glass bead there, which is an extra small silver lined glass bead. And the reason behind the whole Mercury series was to try to imitate the gas bubble that takes place during emergence. So when midges emerge, they get trapped gases in that thorax area that produces this mirror-like flash. And this is a trigger to nearby fish. And so I found that the Merc bead helps separate your fly from the crowd. And oftentimes picky and finicky fish will readily key on this particular pattern. So we're going to begin. This is an 8/0 uni thread, and we're going to secure a piece of small wire, and we're going to run that right along the spine or the shank of the hook, right back towards hook bend. Once we get back towards hook bend, then we're going to advance the thread forward with symmetrical wraps, trying to just keep a very smooth and uniform body. Typically, a lot of the flies that I tie is a less is more mentality. So we want to keep these flies very thin, very sparse. And for the most part, a lot of the patterns that I tie, they're not going to win a fly tying contest, but they're guide flies. And I can assure you that the simplicity of this pattern, don't let it fool you because it is a deadly trout producer. We're going to take this wire now and we're going to reverse rib this to create a segmented body right up towards that thorax area. Now your midge larvae typically are uniform throughout their worm-like body. So when we're tying those, it's important that we have that uniform body. But when we're tying pupa, on the other hand, they have a swollen thorax where the wings and the legs of the emerging adult are going to be popping through. And so we can take a little bit of dubbing here and we can create that bulbous look simply by just taking a little bit of dubbing right behind the bead there. And again, you don't want to get too carried away, just a little bit of dubbing and kind of a little miniature football shape right behind the bead itself. And then we'll whip finish with a little collar and we'll have our completed Black Beauty. Now, as far as fishing this, typically when I see a midge hatch in progress, I'm going to have to determine what part of the water column I'm going to be fishing this fly. Typically, it is going to be more mid-column. And too much weight is as problematic as not enough. So typically I'm fishing a number 6 split shot and trying to keep this thing right in the middle of the column where we'll find fish that are keying heavily on midge pupa.
That pattern, no doubt, has been one of my top producers over the years. So I would encourage you, as tailwater enthusiasts, to tie up a bunch of those, again, in a variety of sizes, from size 18 down to a 24. And just be prepared for those larger spring midges, all the way down to those microscopic midges that we're seeing now. I was on a guide trip yesterday, and the midge hatches are very, very sporadic, and they're very, very small. Got a question here. Why do I reverse wrap the wire? I reverse rib it to build strength into the pattern. The thread goes in clockwise rotation, and the counter wrapping of the wire builds strength into each one of those turns, because you have one material going one direction and another material going the other direction. And it's very easy for me to create that nicely segmented body and also produce that very durable abdomen as well. With that being said, I think we'll move into another must-have midge pattern, which is the Mercury Blood Midge. It's a great pattern, particularly during the winter months, and one of my favorites as a lead fly and a tandem nymphing rig. So with that being said, let's roll on into the next pattern.
Moving on to the next pattern, we're going to be tying one of my all-time favorites in the Mercury series is the Mercury Blood Midge. And if you fish any western tailwater, from the Bighorn to the San Juan, the Yampa, the South Platte, you've probably seen red midge larvae in a stomach pump sample, or potentially a seine. But typically you're going to find larvae in either pale olive, cream, or red. And the larvae that reside in some of the low oxygenated parts of a stream or lake are considered to be called blood midges, and mainly because they contain hemoglobin, which allows them to, it's an oxygen carrying pigment that allows them to live in these low oxygenated places. So yeah, it's a great pattern to have in your arsenal flies for tailwater. And this is a Tiemco 200R, which I really like. It's the curved nymph hook. And then again, I'm going to put the Mercury bead on there, which is an extra small bead. And we're going to take some 8/0 uni thread, red, and we're going to lay in a piece of gold wire, small, secure the wire behind the bead, and then we're going to advance the thread back towards hook bend, again with symmetrical wraps, touching wraps right back towards hook bend. Now this is one of my favorite attractors, particularly during the winter months. I think a lot of times when you fish a fly, you've got to be careful, because it can be a double-edged sword with regard to your attractor. Sometimes people fish big, bright, gaudy patterns that sometimes can fool fish. So when the fishing gets very technical, a lot of times I'll fish a small blood midge as my lead fly or my attractor. Now we're going to advance this thread forward, right back towards the bead and the eye of the hook. Typically, again, my trailers in Colorado, we're fortunate enough because we can fish 3 flies. So check your local regulations with regard to tandem rigs, but fish 1 or 2 flies off of this. Typically I'll fish, a pupa of some sort behind it during the winter months. I'm going to reverse rib this now. Again, just trying to provide a slight hint of segmentation. I'm going to come right up behind the bead, take a couple material locking wraps. pull that wire back. And then what I'll use is a little piece of peacock herl here for the collar. We all know peacock is such a magical fish power catching ability to it. I tie it in tip first because that's the most supple part of that feather. And then I'm going to take a few turns here to create that, and we just got a bit of brittle piece there. And we'll just take that and create our little collar. Take a couple wraps of thread there. And then one thing that I like to keep handy on my tying table is a black Sharpie. I'm going to color the thread black. And then we're going to whip finish. And there you have completed a Mercury Blood Midge.
One of the questions that just saw popped up was, are midges only an important food source on tailwater fisheries? The answer to that is no. I mean, obviously, on our tailwater fisheries, midges are very, very important. They hatch multiple times a day, 365 days a year. And as I mentioned early on, what they lack in size, they make up in numbers. So it's very, very important to come prepared to imitate midges 365 days a year. But that being said, we see some very reliable midge hatches on freestones as well. So whether you're fishing a lake, you're fishing a freestone or a tailwater, you should be prepared to imitate midges on pretty much a nonstop basis. Also, there was a question about the hook. I like that Tiemco 200R hook for my larvas because most of your larvas, they're a size 20. They're quite a bit bigger than the pupa and the adult. In fact, is that you progress through the life cycle of the midge from the larva to the pupa to the adult, you actually downsize one hook. So in other words, if your larva is a size 20, your pupas are going to be a 22, and then your adults are going to be a 24. But you can tie that particular pattern on a 2487 if you like to, or 2488 to get that little bit wider hook gap. I typically like that, the 200R for my midge larva. It just has worked for me over the years, and I continue to go ahead and use that pattern. A starting combo for the winter. I typically, as I mentioned, right now you need some sort of a lead fly. I've been running a lot of egg midge combos and a lot of red larva midge combos, and much of it just depends upon the flow. We all know right now that the flow is very, very low down at Deckers. I did a guide trip there yesterday. The water's at 58 CFS. So it goes without saying that you're not going to be able to get away with a lot of mistakes at this point in time. So if you're fishing something big and gaudy, chances are you're going to be spooking more fish than you are attracting. So a lot of times something small, let's say like a Mercury Midge is your lead fly, trailed by a Black Beauty and a top secret midge. That's really been my go-to rig as of late. Water temperatures down there right now are starting at about 34 degrees in the morning, rising up to about 36 degrees in the afternoon. Fishing was very difficult yesterday. We hooked 6 or 8 fish. We brought about half of those to the net. So definitely you're working hard for every fish that we're catching right now. And it's mainly because of those of the low water temperatures. And once it gets to 39 or 40 degrees, then our chances are much better to find those actively feeding fish. So I think, just it's really based on the conditions. If the flow was 200 CFS, then obviously we could get away with maybe a crane fly or a Pat's rubber leg or something of that nature as our lead fly, trailing some smaller flies. So, but the thing that I don't want you to rule out is thinking outside the box from time to time and throwing something big, particularly in some of those fast, deep slots. Sometimes throwing a crane fly or a big scud or something of that nature can pay dividends down the long haul. So let's go ahead and move on to one of my go-to midges. With that being said, I just talked about the top Secret Midge. It's really my go-to small fly midge this time of season. Rarely do I not have a top Secret Midge on when I'm guiding the South Platte during the winter months. And as I said, I typically err on the small side. I'll run those typically in a size 24 or 26. So let's go ahead and tie the top Secret Midge. I think it'll be a pattern that will work well for you this time of year.
Now we're going to move into one of my favorite winter flies is the top Secret Midge. And this is really my go-to small fly, particularly between November and March. And I think one of the greatest attributes to this fly is the hook. It's tied on a Tiemco 2488. And what I really like about that is the straight eye, but the wide gape. So I think in smaller sizes where you have a tendency to not connect with a 24 or a 26, the beauty of this hook is it really does increase your hookup to landing ratio. We're going to begin with a jam knot behind the eye with an 8/0 dark brown uni thread. And the rib is going to be a piece of 6/0 uni thread. And the rib is what gives most people fits about this fly. So I'm going to show you a couple secrets that I think will help you get this rib dialed in. So we're going to take and secure the white thread, kind of keep a fairly loose tension on the thread as we go back towards hook bend. I take the white thread and I bury it underneath the brown thread with symmetrical touching wraps. It's important to use a new piece of white thread for each fly that you tie, because as you handle the thread has a tendency to flare out and it won't create a nice segmented abdomen. So now we're going to advance the brown thread back forward, again with symmetrical touching wraps. And then, unlike a lot of my other patterns where I'm reverse ribbing, I'm actually going to take the thread and go clockwise with it, again with a fairly light tension to create that segmented body. And when I originally designed this pattern, I was trying to design an abdomen that looked very similar to a quill, but just a lot more durability. And the color schemes are really unlimited here. You can do black, you can do red, you can do chartreuse and black. There's a lot of different color variations that have proven effective for me over the years. And one of the latest ones now is purple. So just let your mind wander as far as the different colors. The wing is tied from a material called Glamour Madeira. And it's actually an embroidery thread. It has some very unique flash properties that make it good for emerging wings on RS2s and this particular fly here. We're going to take a piece of the Glamour Madeira and we're going to secure that into place. Take a few material locking wraps. And like on the Black Beauty where we talked about the importance of the silhouette of the pupa, we're going to take a little bit of super fine rust brown dubbing to create that bulbous thorax look. And we're just going to dub a little football shape in front of the wing, between the eye and the wing. Again, a little bit of dubbing goes a long ways here, so you don't want to get too carried away with that. And then we're going to whip finish. The final step is to pull the wing forward and then clip the wing off. And then I like to tease that wing out with my finger to get all those fibers to stand alone. And that's how you get the maximum benefit of that flash. Now, as far as fishing this fly, I typically will see a midge hatch in progress. And that's when I'm starting to fish mid-column like we talked a little while ago on the Black Beauty. But typically I'm going to use this as my dropper. I tend to fish my larva, like the Mercury Blood Midge, closer to the weight as my lead fly, and then my pupa typically is going to be fished as a dropper. And sometimes I'll fish 2 pupa, but you wouldn't typically fish this as your lead fly since it's a true emerger or pupa. So you want to fish that furthest away from the weight so that it behaves naturally in the water column.
Just had a question there about why they feel that the top secret midge is so effective, and I think so much of it again is that little dash of flash. And I've found that, there's a lot of things that I can control as a fly angler, as a guide, and there's some things that I can't control, particularly in heavily pressured waters like the South Platte. One thing that I can control is I can fish the right water, and I can fish smaller flies than the average person. And I've found the difference between catching fish and not catching fish can be fishing at 24 or 26 this time of year in particular. So I think, using 6X on my patterns is going to allow those to drift, better in the water column. So it's those little nuances that really separate you from the other anglers. So make sure that you're paying attention to detail to those little things. A lot of little things add up to big things this time of year. Another question there was about the placement of the flies, and I think I answered it in the latter part of that video. So typically I'm running my larva and my nymphs, my base nymphs and my larva closest to the weight, and I'm running my pupa and my emergers further from the weight because they behave more naturally in the water column. And also the importance of micromanaging your weight cannot be overemphasized. I typically run a 3-fly rig again with that larva, that nymph closest to the weight, and then a couple of pupas. And then above my attractor, my lead fly, I about 12 inches or so, that's where I put a number 6 split shot. And then I micromanage the weight with a tungsten putty. I use a product called JP's Nymphing Mud, and that allows me to fine tune my weight. And the best way to think about that is if I was fishing a run and I was fishing with, let's say, 3 BBs, and all of a sudden I wanted to make a weight change and I took off 1 BB, I just made a 33% weight change. And you may not think of it in those terms, but you're making those substantial weight changes. Whereas if you're using putty, then you can make those small weight changes. You can make those 5 and those 10% weight changes. So I think if you want to elevate your game to the next level, you need to really pay attention to your depth. So that means adjusting your indicator, which I typically use a yarn indicator because I feel that it is more sensitive than other bobber type indicators. And then also micromanaging my weight. So that's very, very important. And again, being able to decipher what part of the water column those fish are in. Again, too much weight is problematic, is not enough, as we discussed a few minutes ago. So being able to adjust that weight. I will typically adjust my indicator and my weight 10 times more often than I'll change flies. I think so many of us as fly anglers, we have a tendency to outthink ourselves. We know we're not getting a strike, and then all of a sudden, we're thinking, oh my gosh, I got the wrong fly. But you should probably think about adjusting your strike indicator or your weight before you actually change flies, and particularly if you have the flies, your go-to flies, your confidence flies on. So let's go ahead and move into some mayflies now. Obviously, as we get into the spring months, typically the latter part of March, and we get into April, then we have to start thinking about imitating a variety of hatches. And we're going to have midges in the morning, some sort of mayfly activity during the middle part of the day, and then again, midges later in the afternoon and evening. So things become a little bit more complex, and we have to kind of be thinking ahead to match the next hatch as the day winds down. So with that being said, we're going to tie the Mercury Pheasant Tail, which is an offshoot of Frank Sawyer's original pattern with a silver lined glass bead, and I look forward to sharing that with you.
This is the time of year too, not only to tie flies for what we need for our immediate use, lots of midges. You can never have too many midges, as we discussed, and obviously we've tied a few midges, but also it's a great time of year to think about the future and the spring months, what lies ahead. We're going to start, preparing for some Baetis hatches as we move along, and even some of those other flies that we just need to backstock during the height of the season when we're fishing more and guiding more and don't have the time to actually tie flies. But as we start to progress into the spring season, it's time to think about Baetis. And I got a couple different flies that we're going to demonstrate here, but we're going to tie a Mercury Pheasant Tail, which is one of my favorite flies. I begin by clamping a Tiemco 101 into my vise here, and once again using the extra small silver lined glass bead. Typically, this is a Mercury flashback pheasant tail. Again, just adds a little dash of flash with a piece of mylar tinsel for the wing pad, but typically I tie this in sizes 16 right down to a 24. In bigger sizes, obviously we can imitate our PMDs, and as we progress down to smaller sizes in a 24, then we can imitate the small Baetis, the tiny blueing olive that comes off in September and October. And believe it or not, you can even imitate like yellow Sally nymphs if you just alter the color of the pheasant tail fibers as well. So we're tying this in yellow, we're tying it in purple, we're tying it in natural. This evening I'm going to tie it in natural because it's the size or the color that I use most often. And typically size 18 is my overall favorite as far as size is concerned. So I'm going to take 4 fibers for the tail. And a long time ago, I had a friend of mine teach me how to tie a pheasant tail. And the most important thing was to keep it very thin and very sparse. So using a little bit of material is probably the biggest tip that I can offer you on this fly. We're going to take 4 strands of pheasant tail fibers. We're going to take 2 material locking wraps there. If you put too much pressure on it, then the tail is going to flare out. So I'm going to take those 4 fibers, tie them in with 2 wraps, and I'm going to come back with a piece of thin gold wire. And we're going to lay that wire across the shank at a 45-degree angle. Take 2 material locking wraps right at the base of the tail. Pull the pheasant tail material out of the way, and then grab that last piece of wire and advance that thread forward. Now we're going to take the 4 fibers and we're going to make our first turn right in front of the tie-in point on the tail. And then we're going to advance those fibers forward, keeping a very thin and a very sparse abdomen. If you take a look at a Baetis nymph, they're very streamlined, they're very thin, they're very sparse, and bulky imitations don't fish nearly as well as very thin and very sparse. So we're going to take this gold wire and we're going to reverse rib this. This is going to add a hint of segmentation, but most importantly, it's going to create durability in a material that's very, very easy to tear. One brown trout eats this, and without any rib, it's going to just fall apart. So a little bit of wire makes this fly literally bomb-proof. Now we're going to take these 4 fibers here, and we're going to put 2 fibers on either side, and those will be used for our legs. The next thing is to add a little bit of mylar tinsel. Tie-in point is going to be directly behind the bead, and we'll advance that back to about the 50% point on the hook shank. I like to check that because if you pull that wing pad forward, sometimes it'll creep on you. So I like to make sure that I'm right at that 50% point on the hook shank. With regard to the thorax, we're going to use a piece of peacock herl. I tend to prefer using the herl from the eyes. And once again, I'm going to tie it in tip first because the tip is so much more supple and just gives me a really nice full thorax. I tend to go a little bit overboard on the thoraxes on these because peacock will shrink when it gets wet. But I'll typically take 7 or 8 wraps forward there. And I'll take 2 material locking wraps to tie that into place. I'm going to pull the mylar tinsel over the top. Take a couple material locking wraps. Come in and snip off the mylar tinsel. And then rather than getting carried away with a lot of excessive wrap of the thread, I'm just going to whip finish, create a nice small collar right behind the Mercury bead. So again, the color variations on this are I typically tie them in black, I tie them in red, I tie them in purple, I tie them in kind of a yellowish color, an olive color. So again, it's a very versatile fly, depending upon the size and the color, can imitate a wide range of aquatic insects.
There was a question that just recently popped up there about tippet, and that's a great question. Typically, I run a lot of 5X and 6X tippet. I typically, depending upon the size of my lead fly, obviously during the summer months, if I'm running a Scud or something bigger, I can get away with 4X fluorocarbon. But as a general rule, most of the midge mayfly type stuff, I'm leading the 5X fluorocarbon, and then my trailers I tie with a 6X nylon. So a lot of people they're kind of blown away with that, and I go through spools of 6X nylon in a month's time. So, but that's kind of my theory: fluorocarbon to the lead fly, and then I use the nylon, the 6X nylon to my smaller flies, and I really haven't found any reason myself personally to stray from that formula, because I fish over some of the toughest trout in the West, and I found that the 6X in most cases works very, very well for me. So I think there's a question here about winter, what's going on in the South Platte corridor right now, the river drainage. Typically, I think as a tailwater enthusiast, we know that the water comes out of the dam at about 40 degrees, and with the reservoir being at 45% full, and with the low snowpack right now at 76%, I think is what I saw on the news a couple days ago. Denver water is going to keep the outflows very, very low. Minimum flow is 32 CFS on the South Platte, there below Cheeseman Reservoir. So I'm counting my blessings right now that we have dang near 60 CFS coming out. What happens, in a typical tailwater scenario in the winter, the warmest water coming off the base of the dam, and then during the summer months, the coldest water comes off the base of the dam. So it's very paradoxical. But in the winter, obviously at 40 degrees, then the water starts to cool down as it moves away from the reservoir itself. And by the time it gets down to the Deckers area, the general Deckers area, we're seeing, water temperatures down around 34 degrees. In fact, as we get below bridge crossing, and a substantial amount of slush ice, and if we get a little bit further downstream than that, then the river is actually frozen solid. So you can see what happens in a classic tailwater environment during the winter months. And then, of course, during the summer, the water's coming out at 40 degrees, and it warms up as it moves further away from the dam. So those are just some things that you should think about as a tailwater enthusiast. There's a question here about getting a better drift, a consistent drift. I think the biggest mistake that I see from anglers when I'm guiding them is that their nets are too tight. In other words, they need some slack in their system. So typically, we're high stick nymphing as a general rule, but the important thing is, as an angler, is you want to have a little bit of slack in your presentation. A little bit of slack is your friend. Once you get tight, once your indicator system, your nymphing rig becomes taut, then you typically are swinging in the current, and the fish can tell your flies are attached to something. So it's critical that when you mend that you put a little bit of slack into the system so that you're getting that true dead drift. And I think that that's really important. So there's a fine line between using too much line and having poor line management and actually being too tight where you're getting into a situation where you're half mooning, you're dragging in the current. Great question here about the second fly. Do I come off the bend or do I come off the eye? I can honestly say, 30 years ago when my vision was a little bit better, I used to always come out of the eye, and that's how I kind of first learned how to nymph in my tandem rig. But for the past 10 years or so, I've come off the bend of the hook. So typically, space my flies about 10 to 12 inches apart. I see, and I feel that that's a mistake sometimes. Some anglers will space their flies too far apart. In other words, let's just say we're using a Scud for our attractor. And then if you space your flies, 18 inches to 2 feet apart, you've really lost what that fly is designed to do. It's really designed to draw attention to your dropper or your dropper fly. So I typically will space those flies 10 to 12 inches apart. And more times than not, I run a 3-fly rig. But as we discussed a little bit ago, you need to make sure that you're, up to date on the current, tandem rig regulations. For instance, if you go to Montana, you can fish 2 flies. If you go to New Mexico, you can fish 2 flies. So you have to make sure that you're following those regulations. But the beautiful thing in Colorado with a tandem rig like we typically run some sort of an attractor. We talked about a little bit ago. And then you could run an egg pattern, and then you could run a larva and a pupa. So you could really cover your bases with 3 different types of flies. Same thing during summer months, you could run a Baetis nymph and a RS2. So you've got the nymph and the emerger. So it allows you to, kind of match that hatch with some different pads and so on. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move into the next pattern. And again, prepare for that spring and early summer month time frame.
Moving along into another Baetis imitation. This is going to be my Mercury Baetis, and I tie it on a Umpqua 200R. And you'll notice I've got the hook actually slanted down a bit there, and that's because it's going to make tying in the tail a little bit easier. And I'm going to use, again, a extra small Mercury bead, and I'm going to take a jam knot, about 50% point on the hook shank there. Advance the thread backward, and we're going to tie in a tail out of some black hackle. And typically I want the tail on this to be about 2/3 of a shank length long. So I can adjust that and get that exactly where I want by sliding those fibers backwards. And like most Baetis imitations, we want to keep them thin and sparse, as we discussed on the pheasant tail. So I tend to like the superfine dubbing for this because it allows me to keep that abdomen very, very thin, very, very sparse. Typically, we start to see our Baetis starting to hatch towards the latter part of March and extending into the first part of April. Bring that dubbing right up towards the bend there. I'm going to readjust that hook. And once we start to see consistent duns hatching every afternoon, typically between 1 and 3 p.m., we fish a lot of Baetis nymphs, particularly in the shallow riffles and the transitional zones. And those bright and sunny days, we don't have the dry fly fishing that we all dream about, but the nymph fishing can be spectacular. So that's when you want to have a thorough assortment of Baetis nymphs. One of the distinguishing features of a Baetis nymph prior to emergence is a dark wing pad. So I'm going to use a little bit of Zelon, black Zelon, and I'm going to secure that behind the bead and then advance that thread back to about the 50% point on the hook shank. The thorax is going to be a little bit of the superfine dubbing once again, not getting too carried away, because we want to keep this thing thin and sparse. Dub that forward, right towards the Mercury bead. We're going to bring that wing pad over the top. And one thing you'll notice on those Baetis nymphs that are just ready to emerge, they start to get their wing pad almost looks like it's ready to split open. It gets that little hump there. And so this Zelon pulled over the thorax area represents that very, very nicely. Typically, I'll cut that Zelon, and then I'm going to divide this into 2 separate bundles. Take a material locking wrap there, another material locking wrap there. And then the final step is going to be to grab my Sharpie pen once again and color that black before I whip finish behind the bead. The final step is to trim the legs to length. So we'll come in, we'll rest the scissors on our thumb, we'll snip the legs there, and then we'll use our finger to snip the legs on the other side. And then you have a completed Mercury Baetis. Typically fish them in sizes 18 down to 22 in the spring. They're typically 1 to 2 sizes bigger in the spring in comparison to the olives that we see in the fall. So in the fall, I'll downsize to a size 24 to try to imitate the pseudoclone or the tiny blue-wing olive that hatches that time of year.
One of the beautiful things about tailwater patterns is I talked about it initially, is the ease of tying and how fast you can tie these flies. And so we're going through this stuff pretty quick tonight, but the beautiful thing is all of these patterns are going to be archived for your convenience. So you can go back and watch these over and over again. So individually and also on YouTube. So that's the good news there. So if for some reason you weren't able to see this entire program tonight, or you felt like I was tying for a living and tying these things fast commercially, you'll be able to go back and look at those again. Question here is, do you utilize bead heads versus using weight on a light winter rig or a combination? You know, I like bead heads. A great example is the Black Beauty. The original pattern that I designed was just the standard Black Beauty. It was tied on a curved hook, just had black abdomen, a little bit of copper wire, and then the thorax was just a little bit of black superfine. And then we progressed into the Mercury Black Beauty, and then a Mercury Flashback Black Beauty, and then what I feel is an extremely important part of the Black Beauty series is the tungsten bead Flashback Black Beauty, which opens up a whole another scenario for us as a dry and dropper scenario. So, you know, if I'm seeing fish that are feeding on midge pupa and the occasional adult, that allows me to fish, you know, like a Griffith gnat or a high vis Griffith gnat, and then 18 to 24 inches below that, that allows me to fish with that tungsten Black Beauty. So it gives me that high-low rigging opportunity, which can be extremely deadly. And typically I find once that the fish have committed to the adult, then I just snip off that dropper. But as far as weight management is concerned, as a general rule, I don't use bead heads strictly. I'm a big fan of the strategy that I discussed a few minutes ago, where I'm using a number 6 split shot to start with on the junction between my tippet and my leader, and a number 6 is going to allow me to nymph mid column, and then it's also allows me to have an anchor point to apply the JP's nymphing mud. So if I'm fishing, 12 to 18 inches of water, all I need is the number 6 split shot. If the fish are a little bit further back, beyond the transitional zone or a little bit further down in the current, then it allows me to add that tungsten putty. So, it's just one of those things, everybody has their own style. And I've seen some very proficient anglers that use simply split shot, and they're not a big fan of the putty. But I can honestly believe that the putt for me is a game changer, because it allows me to micromanage that weight in a way that I feel that I cannot do with split shot. So I hope that answered the question with regard to weight. We're going to move into a pattern here. It's one of my favorites, and I've said that a lot of times, but this time of year, as we get into May and we start to see the onset of the high water season, is the UV Scud. And, customers always want to know, they get a little bit frightened during the high water season. And, ironically as it sounds, my May is always the first month of the year to book up, mainly because of that high water season and the explosive nymph fishing that takes place in the South Platte corridor. So the UV Scud is truly one of my favorites, and I fish it in an olive and I fish it in an orange. And it's important to know that the Grimaris scuds, the living scuds, are olive, and then the dead scuds. If you're in any type of a tailwater fishery, these vary. A lot of these tailwater fisheries, like the bighorn, orange scuds are such an important food organism there. So a great lead fly in a tandem rig, and a great crossover pattern for an egg imitation. And I think that a lot of people don't realize that we see spawning rainbows clear into the latter part of June in Cheeseman Canyon because of that ice cold water. One other note that, I talked about a minute ago is we've got, we're in such a severe drought here in the Rockies, and with the water being at, Cheeseman 45%, so we're less than half full, obviously. Chances are that we're not going to have a big water year this year. So, typically runoff is anywhere, between 700 and 1,000 CFS on the South Platte corridor. And I suspect this year that we're going to be much less than that, unless we get a lot of rain and a lot of snow this spring. So I think we'll have, a decent flow, to meet downstream demand. But the scuds, the scud season itself is going to be obviously best during those higher flow regimens. So with that being said, let's roll into the UV Scud. I think it's a pattern that you should tie plenty of, and I think it'll become one of your favorite flies during that high water season on any tailwater in the Rocky Mountain West.
One of my favorite times of the year is the high water season. And that's why we're going to tie the UV Scud, because it's a must-have during those times of year when the flow is coming up, which typically takes place in May and June on the South Platte and in a lot of your western tail races. A Scud is one of those flies that you can't live without. I typically tie them in sizes 12 through 18 in orange, tan, and olive. I've clamped a TM code 2457 into my vise, and we'll begin with a jam knot behind the eye of the hook here. I'm going to tie the orange UV Scud this evening. So we're going to use a 6/0 Danville thread and advance the thread back towards hook bend as a little bit of a thread base or underbody, so to speak here. Now this is tied a little different than your traditional fly in the fact that the tail is actually going to be towards the eye of the hook, and the actual front of the scud is going to be towards hook bend. We're going to secure some orange poly right at hook bend, and then we'll advance the thread forward towards the eye of the hook, and then come back and just make sure that's all tied down secure. Leave our thread back at hook bend. I'm going to take a little piece of plastic, a plastic strip that they cut with a razor blade out of actually a Ziploc bag, and I'm going to secure that into place right in front of hook bend. And then the final thing that we should be concerned with is a piece of 4X tippet material for the rib on this pattern. So we'll tie that in once again in the same location as the baggy back. Then we'll take some UV shrimp pink ice dub, and I use olive and tan again in the UV, because if you look at the natural scuds, particularly the olive ones, they have a UV sheen to them, and so you can capture that little bit of UV sheen with this dubbing. So your olive scuds are your living scuds. If you were to seine the river, you would get the olive scuds, the Grimaire scuds, and the dead scuds are orange, and then scuds that are molting are typically tan. So I carry 3 different color schemes of those, again in sizes 12 through 18. We'll put a little bit of this dubbing on now. This dubbing is a little bit trickier to work with in comparison to like fine and dry type dubbings. So don't be too concerned about the dubbing noodle being a little bit thicker than you're accustomed to working with. It's not a problem, because we're going to need to pull this dubbing down for the legs. So I'm going to dub this in a couple different layers, starting at the bend of the hook and then dubbing back towards the eye of the hook. And then what I want to do is try to develop a slight taper from the bend of the hook down towards the eye. If you look at a scud, they're a little bit thicker towards the front end of their bodies in comparison to the rear end of their abdomen. So what I can do here is just build that up, get a slight taper. I'm going to pull the baggy strip over the top. Oop, I got ahead of myself there. I need to pull these legs down. So we're going to take a dubbing brush here and pull down those legs on both sides of the scud. And then I'll use my thumb and my index finger to comb those down. Then I'm going to pull the baggy strip over. Take a couple material locking wraps to hold that into place. Snip off that material, and then I'm going to take my tippet material here. I'm not going to reverse rib this, but I'm going to actually wrap in a clockwise direction. And you got to try to cut through all those fibers. Use your finger to kind of comb those down. And I put a fair amount of tension on that. I want to sink that rib right into that baggy back to create that crustacean look, that segmented effect. And we'll just palmer this tippet material forward. And don't worry about if you get some of that dubbing material trapped in there, because we're going to come back in at the end here and use a bodkin and pull those legs back down. So we'll take a few wraps here, trim off our material there. And then we'll make a nice little head, and we'll whip finish. Trim our thread. I'm going to come in, I'm going to trim the antenna. And then we'll come back and we'll trim the tail. Then I'll typically use my thumb and flare that tail out just a bit. And we'll come back in with our bodkin here, and we'll pull those legs down, the fibers that we trapped when we were ribbing. That's an easy fix. Don't get too worked up, like I said, about it. You can just pull those right out very easily. And then once again, I'm going to pull that down. Then I'm going to trim the fibers straight across with the hook shank, and then from the point of the hook up, I'll trim those fibers off there. So we'll kind of do a couple different cuts there. Give you a look at that top side of it, but you can also see how nicely those legs pull down. Typically use this as my lead fly in a tandem nymphing rig during the high water season, and then I'll trail a couple flies that would match the prevailing hatches at that particular time. Usually we're on the backside of Baetis, but you know, some Baetis are good options at that point in time too, and potentially maybe some caddis that time of year as well. So with the UV Scud and those three different colors, is one of my top guide flies, no doubt, and especially in that high water season in May and June. We're on the backside of the spawn, so a lot of times trout are still looking for eggs, and the trout spawn really late in Cheeseman because the water is so cold. So it's not uncommon to see rainbows on reds clear into the end of June. So they'll eat this as an egg pattern sometimes, but they'll also eat it as a scud. So it's a very, very versatile fly for that particular time of year. So you should tie a few of these up. I think you'll be happy you did. It's one of those patterns that when fish get on scuds, they really look for them because it's a very high protein diet.
It's the time of year, you know, like I said a few minutes ago, you know, to try to get some back stock. It's there's nothing worse than running out of scuds during the height of the season, or running out of Baetis nymphs, you know, middle part of April, or running out of black beauties, you know, in February. So, you know, right now that's what I'm doing is I'm tying up a lot of back stock so that when I'm in the field, when there's a good scud bite and there's a good Baetis emergence, that I have those particular patterns, you know, filled up in my fly boxes. Question is do I fish with eggs? Absolutely. You know, I have no problem fishing with an aquatic worm. I have no problems fishing with an egg pattern. I typically fish micro eggs. I think, you know, the biggest mistake that I think a lot of anglers make is they fish with too big of eggs. You know, I tend to tie my egg patterns in micro eggs on a size 18, a 24, 87. I tie them really, really small. I use my fly foam, and I tie little micro eggs. And so I tie them kind of an apricot color, kind of a McCheese color. Those are the two predominant colors that I use. And again, I really concentrate on tying those small. So egg midge combos, egg Baetis combos are a great tandem nymphing rig. Question is do I only fish scuds during runoff? No, I don't. Scuds, you know, they work well year round. An olive scud this time of year can be a great attractor. So I tend to fish more olive scuds this time of year in comparison during the high water. I got to tell you, I fish an orange scud during the high water season most of the time. So, but don't rule out, you know, fishing a scud 365 days a year. You know, scuds are, they are often, victims of behavioral drift. So they tend to, move around a lot more during those low light situations, early mornings, late evenings, and they're frequently drifting and knocked loose from the current. So, fish that they're always aware of their presence, and fishing with a scud is never a bad idea. So we're going to finish up tonight's program with a pattern that I feel very blessed to have been, able to carry on a legacy for a dear friend of mine, and that was Ed Rolka. And this particular pattern is called the Beadhead Breadcrust, and it's a pattern that back in the early 90s, when Ed was ready to retire from commercial fly tying, he was kind enough to let me come to his house, and he taught me how to split the quills and tie this particular pattern. One point in time, I was supplying, fly shops throughout the Western United States with this particular pattern, and I still tie this fly commercially today. I think it's probably one of the best cased caddis imitations that you could ever fish. I think the biggest challenge, obviously, is finding the materials, the red-faced rough grouse, and then the preparation of the materials can be difficult as well. But the good news is it's just one of those classics. It's one of those patterns that I think all anglers should carry in their fly box, and everybody should learn how to tie. It's one of those patterns that it gives me a lot of satisfaction to share with you this evening.
The final fly that we're going to tie this evening is going to be a pattern that I can't live without either. And it's a pattern that I've been tying commercially for almost 30 years. And it's called the Beadhead Breadcrust. It was a fly that came from Pennsylvania. Ed Rolka popularized it here in the Rockies. And it's nothing more than a cased caddis imitation. It takes a little bit of time to master preparing the materials, but once the materials are prepared, it's a straightforward tie. Typically tie it on a Tiemco 5262, which is a 2X long hook in sizes 12 through 18. The predominant sizes, or the favorite sizes that I use, are going to be a 14 and a 16. I typically will put a 3mm bead on a 14, 2.5mm on a 16, and a 2mm or 1.5mm on an 18. The most important thing when you're dealing with beads is to make sure that you get the bead on straight from the beginning. So I'll take a little bit of extra time here and actually fill in that countersunk side of the bead. So it's going to take 50, 60, 70 wraps to actually make a little thread wedge right behind the bead. I want to make sure that that bead is on straight, because if it gets crooked, then you're going to be fighting that throughout the whole tying process. I'm going to take 2 strands of yarn. This is a traditional 4-strand yarn, and we're going to take 2 strands to form the underbody. We'll take those 2 strands, tie them in, and then we're just going to advance them back towards hook bend. And then as I move this yarn forward, I pack it just a little bit tighter with each wrap to try to develop a slight taper. And we'll trim off the excess material there. Just secure that down. The body itself is tied from a stripped grouse quill. It's a red-faced stripped grouse quill where we've actually trimmed the barbules down to where they're about 1/16 of an inch from the actual quill itself. And then we split that quill in half with a razor blade and then clean the pith out of the inside of that quill. And what we have come away with is a big biot that's very, very flexible. And it allows Tyers to create one of the most realistic cased caddis imitation that's ever been fished. We're going to tie this in tip first, right on the actual underbody, and then we'll advance the thread back to where the material goes down onto the actual hook itself. So the first wrap will be right on the hook band, and then the consecutive wraps will be on the yarn itself. So now what we're going to do is palmer this forward, and you'll see as we move forward, you can see what those barbules do. They just flare out. And we'll trim that extra material off there. And the final step is to take a grizzly hen to tie in the collar. And this will simulate the legs on the caddis. And this is going to be tied in like a typical wet fly style. Then we're going to take 3 to 4 turns. And we'll sweep that hackle back with our thumb and our index finger and make a small collar. Typically use this as my lead fly and my nymphing rigs, and then trail 2 bugs that would match the prevailing hatches once again. But you can see you get that real buggy look to it from that stripped quill. And you can come back if you got a couple fibers that need to be trimmed up, you can come back and just trim those off. But you can see you just get a real buggy looking cased caddis imitation. Again, popularized by Ed Rolka back in the early 70s. It's one of those flies that was great back then, and it's still as good as it was then today. So it's one of those flies that I think that every fisherman should carry in their box, whether they're a tailwater enthusiast or they enjoy fishing freestones. It's one of those patterns. It's very, very versatile, and everybody should carry in their box.
I had a question there about is there any other feathers or feather that works well for the grouse? You know, it's you can, in a pinch, you can use the gray phase. I don't think it looks quite as good as the little pattern that Ed dyed it in that red phase. And that's a difficult, bird to find. It's Wisconsin, it's a Pennsylvania bird, and whenever I got clients from those particular areas, and I always ask them if they're grass hunters, and if they please save me those tails. But if you're in a pinch, you can always try turkey. I know that turkey's not quite as good as a grouse, but it would work in a pinch. And then also, the pattern that I have with Umpqua is a synthetic breadcrust. So we use D-rib and some ginger rooster that is clipped, and we can achieve really the same look for that. And it really solves that ongoing problem with the finding of the grouse. But I've always liked to tie the pattern to the original specifications. I think just out of respect towards Ed Rolka, I think that's the way to go. And I can't even begin to thank Ed for allowing me to carry on that tradition. And it's still one of the most popular flies that we have, in our store. And it keeps busy to this day. So I really appreciate the opportunity this evening to share a few of my guide flies. And I want you to think about this little seminar this evening is it really never ends. If there's anything that I can ever do to help you with regard to matching the hatch, fly selection, choosing the appropriate materials of ice, anything whatsoever, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at the Blue Quill Angler. When you succeed, I succeed. And it's really one of the most rewarding parts of what I do as a professional guide. When you catch a fish, I catch a fish. And I love to get emails from people that say, hey, I had a great day out on the with a top secret midge or whatever. Those kind of things really make me happy. So I appreciate the opportunity this evening to share those patterns with you, and I hope that our paths will cross someday soon on the stream. Thank you very much and have a good evening.